the bravest thing you could do this term isn't getting the school ready for an inspection, but deciding which parts of the system you're going to actively keep out of your classrooms.
Welcome back to Being the Head, the human cost of leading schools. I'm Jackie, a lifelong head now working with leaders across the UK to help them stay strong in the job and in themselves.
And I'm Jane, and together we bring you honest conversations about school leadership, the good, the bad, and the bits that keep you awake in the middle of the night.
In a previous episode with Vicky Wells, we looked at the structure of a well school, but there is a missing piece to that puzzle: bravery. You can have the best well-being policy in the world, but if the leader is too afraid to protect teacher agency, the structure will crumble under the weight of the next inspection.
And that's why we invited Adam Kohlbeck today. Adam is a fellow of the Chartered College and Director of Teacher Quality, and he understands that agency isn't a soft word. It's the engine of expertise, and he's here to help us move from performing for a framework to placing professional judgment front and centre. Adam, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to join us, and welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a real thrill to join you guys. I'm very, very much looking forward to it.
Thank you. Let's look at the hard edge then. The latest 2025 Teacher Wellbeing Index shows that education staff wellbeing has fallen to its lowest level since 2019.
We're also seeing a rise in compliance fatigue. While hours are slightly lower according to the DfE, the meaning of the work is being eroded, and teachers feel that they are being delivered to rather than developed.
We're seeing a workforce that's tired of doing things just because they look good on a deep dive. How do we reclaim the professional soul of the classroom?
Pretty big question to start, isn't it? Reclaiming the soul of the classroom. I like that. I think it probably starts from understanding like what the soul of the classroom is. So like, well, we've just been doing some really interesting work at Chiltern around our teaching and learning strategy, and that's involved me talking to a core group of about 45 teachers from across the trust, and then also bringing in teaching and learning leads and head teachers and that kind of thing. And do you know, the one thing that they all say is central to the teaching and learning is relationships. And that it keeps coming back to that. Like, you know, when we've been looking at our framework, everybody wants to have relationships in there somewhere, and people see it in different ways. They see the place of relationships as, you know, figuring differently dependent on their perspective. But everybody thinks that fundamentally teaching is a relational pursuit. And I think that probably is what sits at the heart and soul of this, because relationships are responsive, and when you're trying to build relationships, whether you're doing that deliberately and effortfully or whether you're allowing relationships to evolve naturally, what sits at the heart of relationship building is just that. It's that commitment to, particularly in a school context, it's that commitment to shared learning. And so I think that, you know, if I was to think about, well, what is the soul of classrooms, it is relationships and it is responsiveness. That was the other point I wanted to make there, actually, was just that what sits at the heart of relationships as they evolve is this idea of responding. So as people shift and change, we shift and change together. And sometimes we shift and change towards each other, and sometimes we shift and change away from each other. But this idea of like who we are, and therefore what our relationships are, is constantly shifting and changing. And that requires a responsiveness, which probably isn't built into how the modern classroom is understood at a sector-wide level, I would say.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that we don't have that now, and we're moving away from that, do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is we're products of the system, because I think if you look across the world and across different industries, whenever you find a sector that is really high on accountability, it becomes really high on other things as well, like transactional relationships and observable performance and metrics and surface level indicators of effectiveness. And I think where we've got such high stakes accountability in the education system, we've opened the door to all of those things, which fundamentally don't get to the depth that's required to really understand each other. I think some of it as well, like this is probably getting quite philosophical and deep for like the early minutes of this podcast, but I think that there is an assumption that we should all see reality in the same way, right? There's an assumption that we all do see reality in the same way. And I think if you look at that across the sector, that would be manifested in things like one-word judgments of effectiveness around particular areas. You know, the idea that you can evidence how effective something is, the idea that you can evidence how effective a teacher is from a 10-minute drop-in. I don't see any compelling or convincing evidence anywhere in the research base that says that's possible, but yet we're still continually trying to do it. But that is all ultimately, that's built on the idea that there is one reality that can be known in the same way by everybody. But actually, I think that there's a whole other way of viewing reality, which is that it's relative. And, you know, we all have our own versions of reality, and that by opening up dialogue and talking about what our versions of reality are, we can come to a shared understanding of what we accept the reality to be. But even then, it's not the reality. And I think I think that kind of philosophical starting point to what education is missing. There's a lot to be learned, I think, from, maybe we can dig into this a bit later, but there's a lot to be learned from non-Eurocentric ways of knowing and ways of being. Theories like Ubuntu and Dadiri, which I think, there's so much we can learn from both of those, which are all essentially about like indigenous ways of knowing that involve, sitting in the reality. I don't think we sit in the reality very often in education. I think we're constantly trying define what the reality is, and then in a way that makes it really difficult to sort of argue or disagree with.
I think the film that's just come to my mind is Sliding Doors. There are so many different realities and things and happening at so many different levels. But you're right, we're too quick to rush and move through things because you've got that accountability all the time. But actually sitting in the discomfort, sitting in that time to reflect, it's gone. Also, you're talking about indigenous cultures. They are solely based on relationships. It's all relationships. That's where the trust is built. Is a perfectly consistent school actually just, I'm going to use the word soulless, a soulless school? Adam, you specialise in adaptive expertise, and consistency is the holy grail for many trusts, many schools. But is perfectly consistent school actually just a soulless school? And where is the line between quality assurance and professional theft of a teacher's autonomy?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to like, what do we understand consistency to be? And like, what is our definition of consistency that we're working with? Because I think we assume that consistency refers to consistency of action, i.e. consistency of what I can see when I walk in a room, when I walk into a classroom. But actually, I think that a far healthier way to view consistency is a consistent way of understanding teaching, a consistent way of thinking about teaching, of talking about teaching, and learning with all of those things as well, but not necessarily a consistent way of enacting teaching. And I think if we were to reframe that idea of consistency through that lens, which ultimately just means that we have a shared mental model of how learning happens and a shared mental model of what effective teaching might look like. And I say might deliberately because the influence of context is so key there. I think that gives us a healthier and probably also a more effective way of thinking about consistency, but certainly one that places the teacher and the teacher as a decision maker at the heart of what effective practice is. Because if what we're saying is that consistency is about what we understand and how we talk and how we discuss and how we think, then it needs somebody to do something with all of that understanding, thinking and talking, and actually translate that into an action that is right for the context of the moment. And that person is the teacher, which would then, if we understood consistency in that way, I think what we do is return a lot of agency to teachers.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely makes a lot of sense. Well, our understanding of consistency, does that actually make a difference to children at the bottom line, isn't it? And that's what we're all about, is that we want to make a difference to children's lives. We want to ensure that they get the best chance. And if we're putting those barriers up because we have to have a consistent X, Y, and Z in our schools, then we need to really go back to the moral purpose of why we're there, don't we?
Yeah, and I think, it's being realistic about how we've got to where we are. I think sometimes we, when I talk to leaders who work in schools where there is a highly prescriptive model of what teaching should look like, and I talk to them about why that is, they often say, well, because all students deserve the best and I've got a duty to make sure it's the best. I think what they actually mean is all students deserve not to have bad teaching. And actually, if I go ultra prescriptive, what I will do is limit bad teaching. But what we're saying is this is all about lifting the lid on great teaching, when in effect, I don't actually think that's what we're aiming for. We're trying to sort of stabilize the floor, but by doing that, we're putting this concrete ceiling on top as well, which means that, okay, it may not ever be bad, but what potential is there for it to be exceptional? Often I would say we're limiting that because we're being too prescriptive on what we expect in classrooms.
My earlier career as a head teacher, I was really prescriptive. I liked things done in a certain way. But listening to what you say, that was to ensure or limit the not such quality teaching that was going on. So it was to sort of baseline it. And I think it was only after years, once I was happy that there was a baseline and expectation of this is what the expectation was, that staff knew what they were doing. We had that common language, that I then felt brave enough to step back and let their teachers then take ownership for their own classrooms, their own cohorts, because you're dealing with so many different personalities, your teachers as well. And that's when I then saw the teaching and learning start to take off in the school that I was leading. But that took a lot of years to get there. And for me, as a leader, when you think actually the buck stops with me, I found that quite a stressful step and decision to make and to take. But when I did, the impact was great to see. And you could see the culture change. The children became more, the children's voice came through louder, which just meant that the whole culture and teaching and learning element of it really did start to sort of bloom. But that does take bravery, I think.
It does. It takes masses of bravery. And I think that, it sounds sometimes when I talk about this stuff that I'm bashing head teachers for not being brave enough. And I don't mean to do that at all, because the reality is that in a really high stakes system, when your job is at risk based on the views and opinions of 4 visitors over a 2-day period, right, there's really, really difficult to have that bravery. And actually, unless your mortgage is almost paid off and you're pretty close to retirement, it's very difficult to really have that bravery. If you're 35 with family and kids at home, it's a risk, and you end up thinking, well, yeah, okay, I feel like I owe this to myself as a professional to do the right thing, but what about what I owe to my family? I owe that a roof over their heads ultimately. And it's a shame, because we have kind of created a sector that does limit that professional judgment. Or perhaps it doesn't limit it, but it doesn't create the conditions whereby professional judgment is something that people feel safe using. And I think that's, when you listen to people talk about the system and people talk about how much autonomy schools have and school leaders have, on paper, yeah, they do. They have a lot more actually than in many other countries. But the cost of exercising the wrong agency, the cost of getting it wrong, is so great that everybody becomes obsessed with getting it right. And so then you just go straight back to the system and go, what does getting it right mean? And therefore, it looks a bit like this. Well, then you've just removed all of that agency that in theory the system provides.
So you're talking really actually at policy level and government level, and we need a shift. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I'm probably not the only person saying that either, I think. But it's I think if we genuinely believe that people sit at the heart of this, and that if we genuinely believe that professionals in schools are best placed to make the right decisions for students, and we genuinely believe that we're producing teachers that are in a position to make the best decisions in the moment, then we have to reform that system, because the system undoubtedly is limiting that professional judgment, and it's limiting the role of teachers as decision makers. I think in some ways it's a vicious circle, isn't it? You kind of, what comes first? If I think back to the beginning of my career, my mentor in my first job had been teaching 15 years before they became my mentor. Now the average mentor has, and this isn't like a piece of data I got from anywhere in particular, but anecdotally it feels like the average mentor has been teaching maybe 4 or 5 years. So what that means is we've got less experience being imparted onto new teachers, which then means it's harder for those new teachers to develop quickly. And therefore, is that why we're putting in what on paper looks like a scaffold, but actually it's just a case of, right, let's limit these teachers from being bad, because we know that we haven't got the skill and the expertise and the experience left in the system, because everyone's gone, that will actually support them to develop in a more sustainable way. So again, it's the system has kind of eaten itself there. And the reality is a lot of the sort of blame for that is often put on teachers and teacher training providers, and teacher education isn't what it used to be, and teacher education isn't good enough. And there's some truth in that, but we've got to face up to the fact that we're asking people to be teacher educators far less experienced than what we were asking them to do 10, 15 years ago. And there's got to be an effect of that we have to acknowledge.
Definitely. I feel very strongly about that, about the system that we've created now. When you start working, and Jane and I have just a wonderful experience of talking to people all over the globe now through the podcast and hearing about their different types of accountability in their system, and it is completely different to ours. And actually, when we start talking about it with other educators from other countries, they're absolutely agog at what we have that we have in this system, in this country. So yeah, totally. I'd like to move, Adam, to this concept that you talk about, leaders being shields, and I was as a head. I think I had that in my brain that that I was the person that took the flak, because then I would be able to allow my teachers to carry on and do the work of the teaching rather than dealing with all the other stuff that it. So I used to absorb that, and I used to absorb the Ofsted, although I had a very maverick way of looking at Ofsted. Come whenever you want, and if you don't like it, you don't like it sort of attitude. That's how I used to deal with my Ofsteds. But now I think people do carry that Ofsted sort of badge very heavily, and also absorb the anxiety. How do you deal with that, or how can a leader shield without becoming that sponge that takes it all on and then ultimately breaks because of taking it all on, do you think?
So I think there's a case for leaders being a bit of a shield day to day, and I don't necessarily mean that in terms of they absorb everything, but I think that leaders can set up systems which mean that there is less that comes through the door, and also less that gets to the teachers. So for example, like I talk a bit about removing the sludge. So a key role of leadership is to remove the sludge that teachers have to wade through to actually do their job. So for example, in my last school, we had a system whereby essentially no teacher ever had to phone a parent. They could if they wanted to. If they wanted to get in touch with the parent, they could do. But if there was anything that had happened during the day, if a kid had a mishap with someone else, if there'd been any kind of incident, it was an SLT member that would phone the parent and would have that conversation. And that can sound a little bit like, oh, but aren't you then diluting the relationships between the class teacher and home? You're actually protecting the relationships, because then the relationship that the class teacher has with the parent becomes about how has their day been in class. It's those conversations that you have on the gate at the end of the day during dismissal. And it was great, like, they learned to add 2 fractions together today, like how brilliant. The class teacher doesn't have to then throw in that actually they hit someone at playtime. Like, that conversation is being taken care of by somebody else, by a senior leader. Now, parents tended to be pretty happy with that because they felt like the issue was being dealt with at quite a senior level, because you're speaking to a senior leader. Senior leaders tended to be pretty happy with that because they're the ones that have got the headspace to keep coming together on a weekly basis and sharing trends and things that they're picking up from around school. So we would have a system every lunchtime where a member of senior leadership would be in what we call conflict resolution. So if there was any kind of conflict that needed to be escalated beyond the midday meal supervisor, they'd come to conflict resolution, we'd resolve the conflict, and then we'd make a phone call to parent. And every week when we meet as an SLT, we can then see all of the different students who have come into conflict resolution. So if someone's been in there 3 or 4 times in that week, we see it. And then we can think, okay, well, what do we need to put in place for that student? But then we then follow up with those parents. We have the parents in to create the plan because we're the ones that have got the flexibility around our diaries. The contact that teachers then have with parents is all around learning. And that's the conversations that teachers are happy to have. When you look at the data that came out of the TDT last year, there's quite substantial evidence to suggest that one of the things that teachers really hate doing the most and causes them the most stress and anxiety is phoning parents. Well, that's not because they're worried about dialing a phone number. It's because what they're worried about is negative backlash from a message that's unwelcome. And so if SLT can absorb that stuff because they've got the space to be able to do it, frees up teachers' headspace, but it also frees up some of that anxiety they feel.
And I guess it gives that message to parents that actually those teachers are there to talk about education, and actually the other stuff is dealt with at a different level, but they're there and they need to focus on that.
That's right.
And I think it's about
Yeah,
protecting that relationship. It's protecting that relationship, because if you've got that sort of negativity coming, I don't know what the thing is. If you've had one negative thing, you've got to have, so many tens of positive things to counteract that. It's protecting that relationship. I think that was a really useful idea, and I'd never thought of it in that way in the schools that I've led. I think, Adam, I had a conversation with a head teacher. He's been in leadership a few years now, and he's dealing with some quite difficult, challenging issues in their school. If you could give a sort of fairly new leader a checklist for bravery, what 3 questions should that leader ask themselves before they implement anything new, any new non-negotiable, just to satisfy an external framework or another trend that is coming down the road? What would they be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, I suppose. So what 3 questions should they ask themselves before they... I suppose the first thing, and this is just me being difficult, but I think in the first instance, like the idea of non-negotiables, I think everything's negotiable because, for example, I was talking to a head teacher recently. I'm now in a trust-wide role, and we were talking about a particular piece of work that we're doing, and this head teacher is worried because they don't want to have their kind of agency as the head of their school taken away. They don't want to have to do something that doesn't fit for their school. And this head teacher literally said, for example, Adam, if you tell me to do this, I'm just not going to do it. I will just not do it, and you will have to sack me. And I'm like, well, we're never going to sack you because you're brilliant. So actually, like, I can't call this thing a non-negotiable because it is very much negotiable, because actually you're that good that if you don't do it, well, we're probably in reality just going to let you not do it. And we're probably going to keep asking you nicely to do it. But, in reality, we don't work that way anyway, and we wouldn't kind of impose stuff. But I think that leaders sometimes think that a non-negotiable is an option, but it's really not, because if your teachers just refuse to do it, what are you going to do? Like, you're not going to get rid of them all. So everything is negotiable. I think that fundamentally, I think the first question would have to be like, is it right for the school? And by the school, of course, front and center the students. Like, is it right for the student? But and if it's right for the students, it's by definition it's right for the school. I think the next question would be like, what am I going to take away if I'm going to ask people to do this thing? So we're not just constantly adding initiative on top of initiative. And then I think the third thing would be like, to what extent am I willing to be vulnerable around it as the leader? So, and again, this is just an example of how I've done things in the past. I hate doing one-to-ones. I'll do them if people want to meet with me one-to-one, I'll happily do it. But like, I would never call like a one-to-one with this person and a one-to-one with that one and try and sort of like engineer a situation. I would much rather just get everybody in a room and argue it out. And I think that's because I think I'm quite comfortable with vulnerability. I don't feel a pressure to be right in front of my colleagues. And that's probably, I guess you could say that's a strength, but I think that's really important with anything that you're going to bring in. Like, ask yourself, to what extent am I willing to be vulnerable with it? Because if I'm willing to be vulnerable, then it probably means that I really believe in it, because I have faith that the belief that I've got in this thing will carry through, and that people will follow because they'll also see the value in it. If it's something where I think, I'm not sure I'm ready to be like really vulnerable with that and open it up to criticism, it's probably because I'm not actually convinced myself. So I think that would be the real key one. Like, to what extent am I prepared to be vulnerable about this thing? Because if I'm not, it's probably not something that I believe in myself, and therefore probably shouldn't be doing.
I think they're 3 really good questions. 3 really, really good questions. And I think the one thing is, what am I going to take away? I've walked, and Jackie's walked into many schools where we've had to go in to raise standards, to stabilise the school community. And a lot of when you start unpicking what it is, it's the school that has literally taken any initiative that's come through and just piled it in and in. without actually adapting it, without actually asking themselves, is it the right thing for the school? Is it the right way? How can we adapt it to meet the needs? And what am I taking away? Because they're just added one thing on top of the other. And that in itself causes confusion. And, going back to that consistency element, when you've got so many different initiatives, staff are confused and they don't know which one to use or how to use it, and which is best and how's the best. And that in itself builds inconsistency. So, yeah, they're really good. Really good questions. Thank you.
Do you think that, Adam, is also linked to our accountability system? This fear of we've got to get it right. So we try all these different things and we load them on because we are trying to find that holy grail of actually we want to be the best and it goes back to that moral purpose. I don't think I've come across anybody who's gone into teaching that didn't really want to make a difference to children's lives in my career. They just have different moral purpose and different compass around it. And that's where it comes to be that tension. So I'm going to really push you now, Adam. I'm going to say, if you were sitting, and we're not talking Gemma Collins today, if you were sitting with the Secretary of State and you had a choice to rip out one fundamental pillar of our current accountability system, knowing that it would cause a bit of chaos or absolute chaos, but it would save the human beings inside and also the relationships that you've talked about inside, what would you choose to get rid of first?
I think that I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and kind of rephrase it a little bit, but I think that it's less about taking something away and more about reframing what's there. So I think that our accountability system at the moment, you could essentially characterize it as the person above me. It's me proving to the person above me that I can get the person below me to do something. And often, it doesn't really even matter what that thing is. But if I can get them to do something, then that I've asked them to do, then I'm a strong, good leader who can show impact. And the problem with that is that you're constantly that's where we get that constant competition from all the time. And that's where you start to have a system that incentivizes you to highlight inadequacies of the layers below you. So it incentivizes you to say, well, look, I could achieve better if the people below me were better because they're the tools that I've got to work with, right? Which again, just takes you back into that really transactional realm. And that goes right the way up from, line managing MDSs, midday meal supervisors, right the way up to how Ofsted hold school leaders to account. It's all about can you prove that what you're doing is actually having an effect, different from effective, having an effect. I think that if I could push for one thing from the Secretary of State, it would be that we rework what we mean by accountability and we see it more as a circle. So I think if I was going to change one thing, I think that I would probably just rework the question a little bit, I suppose. Rather than take something out, I think I would probably reframe what's currently there. So the problem with our accountability system, I think, at the moment, is that accountability ultimately means, and this is in terms of the lived reality of it, it seems to mean me proving to the person one rung above me that I can get the person one rung below me to do something. And often it doesn't really even seem to matter what that thing is, as long as I can show that I can get them to do a thing. And it's almost like that shows that I can have an effect on people. I can get them to do these things because I'm a strong leader and therefore I can have an effect. Whereas I think what that actually creates is this system whereby I'm incentivized to suggest that the people below me are actually not as competent as me, because then it allows me to say to the person above me, well, look, I've achieved this, but if I had even better people below me, think what I could achieve then. It's other people that are the limitation rather than me being the limitation. Whereas what I think is a much healthier way of viewing it is to view accountability as, rather than it being a hierarchy, but to view it as a circle. So at any level, we have this shared aim in the middle of the circle, and everybody that's sat around the circle has a role to play, actions to take in service of this shared aim. And everybody is accountable to each other to do the things that they're saying they're going to do in service of this aim. So, head teacher is round the table, class teacher, TA, midday meal supervisor, parent, everybody comes round the table and goes, well, this is the bit that I can add to that collective aim. And so therefore what that does is it kind of creates a shared burden of accountability, if you like. So it's not that, if we don't achieve our aim, it's not that it's one particular person's fault, because in reality, it's never as simple as that. It's a system flaw. And it's a flaw in how all of these different parts have operated together. I think you could have a model of national school improvement that was built around that. I think if, at the moment, for example, within our inspection system, there is very little accountability that the inspectorate hold for improving schools. And that's probably deliberate in many ways, right? So, it's probably not the role at present of the inspectorate to actually improve the schools. It's the role of the inspectorate to make a judgment on overall effectiveness. And, people can argue about how valid and reliable that judgment is. At the moment, their role isn't one that's actually around improving the school. If we had a role for the inspectorate, which was about contributing to improvement and to some extent being accountable for the quality of that advice, support, whatever it might be, being accountable to the school, but also to the system for the quality of that advice, I think all of a sudden people would start to feel a lot more collegiate about the whole thing. And you would remove this thing of, if the school doesn't improve, it's the head teacher's fault, they've got to go. Because it's just never as simple as that, yet we're treating it in that way. So yeah, I would say reframe the accountability system to be a circle rather than a hierarchy, and make sure that the inspectorate are part of the circle, not above the circle, or, watching the circle from afar.
Thanks for that, Adam. And I think that's perfect. Yeah, it's really, I mean, you start, heads will do this. They'll start reflecting on that and their own experiences at the moment as to, where we are with this accountability system and how we could improve it, and making sure you've got the credibility in order to do it as well. That's the other side of it, isn't it? Making sure that we've got people that understand it uniquely well, especially for all the different models that we've got out there in our education system, in order to give the right advice and to help. And that's all we want, really, isn't it? We want to make sure that those children get the best possible outcomes.
If you think about the role of the head teacher, right? The head teacher has the role to evaluate the effectiveness of their own school, but also to improve the effectiveness of their own school. So the head is accountable for the accuracy of their overall effectiveness judgment, but they're also accountable for the improvements that they make. That's probably fair, but no one else has got that same accountability on both sides. So the inspectorate currently has an accountability on the fairness of and accuracy of their effectiveness judgments, but they don't have accountability related to improvement. And I think by adding a bit of accountability to the inspectorate around the improvement, you're actually then, I think heads would probably find it much easier to relate to the inspectorate, and the inspectorate would find it easier to relate to head teachers. So we're right back to that relational thing that we started off this podcast with. That's at the heart of all of it. And if we can help people relate to each other better, we should find that we get better dialogue and a system that we're all happier with.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to move on now, Adam, to a If I Only Knew. We have this section in our podcast every week, and we always look back and we reflect. So looking back at where you are in your career now, is there one thing that you wish you'd known about leadership bravery now that you wish you knew when you first started?
Yeah, I think probably, and this is going to sound probably a little bit kind of over the top or risky or something, but I think it would be if I'd only known that the chances of getting sacked were actually quite slim, just because I think that quite often in the early part of my leadership career, I think I was really cautious around, how's this going to be viewed? How's this going to be understood? And how's it? But actually, like in the early part of my leadership career, I was still a class teacher as well. And I was a class teacher who, at that point in my career, was getting really good outcomes. It wasn't always the case. Like when I started off, like the first term of my NQT year was a complete car crash. I had like 2 major museums in London evacuated for bomb scares that I'd caused by leaving my bag unattended and things. It was really, really bad. And I was just terrible at teaching as well. After the first term of my NQT year, the head teacher at the time sat me down and was like, "Look, Adam, we think you're a really nice guy and everything, but, we've got Ofsted coming. We don't really want you to be here when they come." So I thought, like, amazing. I played that brilliantly. But looking back on it, I obviously realized they were that desperate to get rid of me. I did then get to the point where I was doing pretty well and I was getting pretty good outcomes. And the reality is that, like, my value to the organization at that point was, in a transactional sense, it was that I was getting good outcomes. But in another sense, it was that I was hardworking. I was aligned with the school's values and the vision of that school. And I was contributing a lot more, I think, than what I realized I was at the time. And so actually in that space, it probably would have been quite, I could have taken a few more risks and made a few more mistakes. And actually nobody would have been really angry with me for it. They'd have just helped me grow from it. But I think I probably was a bit conservative at that stage. But then, if I'd only known, I suppose, if I'd only known that, maybe I would have acted differently in that initial part of my leadership career. But the fact that I didn't, I think, makes me more and more determined to make sure that I set the conditions for other people to do that in the early stages of their leadership careers and teaching careers as well. So,
what about you, Jay?
I think following on from Adam, I think I was so concerned about doing the right thing and making sure that everything was right and consistent, that I just kept taking things on and on and on, like we talked about, and never actually thinking what we're going to take away. And I just wish I'd known that no, I could say no, there wasn't going to be any consequences, and actually no was a full sentence. I didn't have to explain my reasoning behind it. As a leader, that was my decision, and no should have been enough. But I wasn't brave enough.
Yeah. I think for me, and this is a tough one for me to actually admit, is I was driven by status. I wanted an outstanding, not just one school. I wanted outstanding. I wanted NLE status. I wanted system leader status. I wanted to be an Ofsted inspector. I wanted to do this. I wanted to do that. I wanted to do the other. I don't think I spent enough time working on culture to be a legacy in my school. I left my schools in a better place than when I started, but I don't think I actually built a really strong legacy of culture. I think I was very hell-bent on achieving what I needed to achieve out of the school rather than thinking about that. And I don't usually admit that, but I think that is a massive thing about my personality and my sports background is I wanted to be a winner and I wanted that badge.
I think it's one that people will really resonate with or it will really resonate with people because we are increasingly in society, I think, obsessed with what we achieve and what we get to. We're obsessed with like the end goal. And I think in education, you see that all the time. Like how much time do we spend talking about end points, start points, outcomes? Actually, like the beauty of education is in the becoming, not in the being. It's in the becoming, which is the bit that sits in the middle part of that journey. And I think, enjoying the process of becoming, whether that be at like a personal level, an individual level, or at a whole school level, like enjoy the process of your school becoming the community that it can be. I think sometimes, we do focus too much on the outcome and not enough on the process.
Yeah, I definitely did. And if I had my time again, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that at all. Right. So one practical action this week, find one monitoring task and instead of ask a teacher, what's a professional decision you made today that worked for a child, even if it wasn't in the plan, is my top tip. Jane, your top tip.
Okay, I think mine is structural. So it's audit your improvement plan and highlight everything you're doing because of the framework. And if it doesn't help a child or a teacher, have the bravery to delete it. Get rid of it. Adam, what would be your top tip?
For me, I think it would be alignment. So like alignment of action. I think that there's a lot that goes on in schools that could be brought together under one priority lens. So for example, if you've got a priority around driving student thinking in lessons, let's say that's your priority, make sure that your drop-ins are looking at that and make sure that your bulletins to staff are about that and make sure your assemblies are about that and everything keeps coming back to the same thing, so that people are firstly sort of reminded of what the most important thing is, because people do forget because there's so much going on in schools, but also so that people don't feel endlessly fatigued with all of the different foci that you've got. So alignment of activity around one central priority.
Yeah. We put in too much, don't we? Yeah. Especially with these 3-year plans and all these different things that we've got.
I had to write a 3-year and then a 5-year plan. And I was like, I think
the thing is though, it's
time was I'm not going to be here in 5 years.
Yeah. leave year 4 and year 5 columns blank. Yeah. The thing is, I think it's built into the structures that we have traditionally in schools. We've got a senior leadership team of 4 people. So therefore we'll have 4 school development priorities and each person will lead on each thing. and we're going to hold each leader accountable for the progress that's made. And so therefore, those people just end up fighting for attention and fighting for time to prove their own individual impact again. And therefore, everybody just ends up slowing each other down, and no one ends up fully satisfied that they've had the impact they wanted to have. Whereas if we just had one priority that everybody's working towards at a time, we make much more progress much more quickly.
Yeah, totally agree.
Little steps.
Well, thank you. Thank you so
My
much
pleasure.
for joining us today. I know it's been difficult with the heat and everything, but we've persevered. So thank you so much. And thank you for all the work you're doing. If anybody wants to get in touch with you or wants to follow what you're doing, is there a way that they can do that? Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm on LinkedIn I'm at Mr. Adam Kohlbeck, and with that awkward spelling of Kohlbeck, Kohlbeck. So I'm on LinkedIn. I also I do a couple of podcasts. I run the EduPulse podcast, and I also run a podcast called Teaching on Purpose, which is all about teacher decision making and professional judgment. And other than that, you can find me on Substack as well. So I've got a Substack also called Teaching on Purpose. So yeah, Teaching on Purpose is the main thing to search for. You'll find the podcast and the Substack through that, and then EduPulse as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
So as you finish this episode, I want you to name 3 things. 1 performative task you're going to let go of, 1 teacher you're giving permission to fail to, and 1 boundary you're setting for your own front door tonight.
That is the energy infrastructure. If you want more of this strategy, you need to sign up for Being the Head fortnightly briefing, which you can download directly from our kit page. All the links are in the show notes. If you have a question or want to share your own doorstep stories, our new email is beingthehead@gmail.com.
And before we finish again, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's been difficult. It's been a busy week, busy day for you, and it's the end of a very, very chaotic half term, I think, for everybody. But your expert and insight and honesty have been really sort of inspirational. So thank you so much. Again, if you're interested in any of Adam's work, we've put links in the show notes, as well as links to his agency audit and a template for that bravery checklist, which we discussed.
Thank you for joining us.